Hello, I'm Danielle, and in this video I will be taking you out on the Chobe River to see if the Sony Alpha 9 II, which has been around for a few years now, is still holding up as a great camera option for wildlife photographers. I'll be looking mainly at how it tracks different birds and animals in different scenarios, and then I'll be telling you how I experienced using a Sony camera being a Nikon shooter myself. Lastly, I will tell you whether I think this camera is still relevant and a good option specifically for wildlife photography today, especially if the latest mirrorless cameras are above your budget or if you're considering switching systems. Please note I'm not sponsored by Sony, so it will be my personal unbiased opinion. Here we go. Here at Pangolin Photo Safaris, we have guests arriving with a wide variety of camera brands, and it's our job to make sure they get the best photos possible with their own gear. A lot of our Sony guests are still arriving with the A9 II, so when Sony recently offered to send us this camera for a week, I was thrilled to be able to use it. I used it with a 600mm f4 lens as well as a 100 to 400mm f4.5 to 5.6 lens. Let's start with the tracking capabilities, as this is the make or break factor for many people shooting wildlife nowadays. I've tested it on different sized subjects, including some unusual animals that don't necessarily fit the typical animal shape, such as crocodiles and hippos. I also tested it in different scenarios: birds in flight, or taking off, backlighting, shooting through obstructions, etc. I mostly used flexible spot medium tracking, as we have a lot of distractions in wildlife photography, and the wider you set your focus area, the more chance of the tracking catching onto something else moving in the frame. In this mode, you'll see me placing the focus point close to where I want the camera to track it, and it follows it from there. I did use wide and zone tracking at times, and it worked very well in specific situations. As with any camera, the more you use it, the more you will get to know exactly how it thinks and which settings work best in which specific scenario. Note that I photographed from a moving boat in most cases, so you'll be seeing an exact rendition of what I saw through the viewfinder, albeit a bit shaky at times. This is when tracking really comes in handy, when you struggle keeping the focus point on the subject. Let's see how it did on birds and mammals, small to large. It took a few tries to catch a small bird, but it held on well with this kingfisher. It tracked this pied kingfisher well, considering that the reed it was on was blowing around in the wind. On medium-sized birds like this egret, it locked on well to the head as a recognizable shape. It did like catching onto the contrast on the fish eagle's shoulder and needed slightly more accurate placement, so in this case I would not use zone area, for example. As for larger birds, it tracked this vulture's head well until the vulture started moving fast and flapping its wings. With this yellow-billed stork, it picked up onto the beak contrast, which would still result in a sharp head. Sometimes the baboon's ear was recognized from the side, however it did pick up the eye when the baboon turned its face towards the camera. As for crocodile, at first no, and then yes, which is very, very impressive. With this lioness, it did well at recognizing the eye at times, and other times it picked up areas of contrast on the face. Considering the eye is not very defined in a buffalo, it did well here at recognizing the eye. It did a great job of sticking to the eye of this hippo in the water in challenging light, and with the hippo quite small in the frame. A hippo outside the water, and it held on to the eye well after I placed the focus point there. It caught onto the giraffe's eye and tracked it well for an unusual looking subject, I'd say. Elephants were hit and miss, but it did detect the eye sometimes, which is quite impressive. Now let's see how it performed in different scenarios. Birds in flight. I was very impressed at how it followed this bee-eater. If we slow the clip down, you can see how it follows the bee-eater as it leaves its perch. Birds in flight with distractions, I replaced the focus point once, after which it held on to the flying bird until it landed. thin subjects, very hard without tracking usually, and in this case it did a very good job at picking up the head and sticking to it. Subject behind a distraction, it performed exceptionally well in this scenario and stayed locked onto the bird despite the moving grass being closer to the camera than the bird was. Large bird in flight, it tracked it all the way despite changing backgrounds and contrast, sometimes locking onto the body. Slightly faster flying bird, it performed very well. And then a bird flying erratically, it tracked it even when the light was very low. Lastly, strong backlight. With correct initial placement, it stuck to the silhouetted subject. As you can see from the footage, the A9ii did a pretty good job of tracking most subjects. I would say that it had some difficulty initially locking onto something, but once it locked on, it was really good at following it. Remember that the tracking is always very customizable depending on your subject. To me, tracking matters most for birds in flight, in which case I think it performed well. The larger the subject was in the frame, the easier it was for the camera to track it. It may not be as fast as the latest models, and it may need a little bit more guidance from the photographer, but it definitely still gave me many more keeper shots where I would have lost them had I not used tracking at all. Now, as a Nikon shooter, how did I find switching over to a Sony camera? I'm coming from using a D850 for the last few years, and I haven't received my Z9 just yet, so if you're a Nikon shooter, you might just be in the same boat. The weight. It's definitely easier holding up this camera for 5 minutes than holding up my D850. Now, this is not specific to Sony, as mirrorless cameras in general are lighter than DSLRs, but it's something I definitely noticed switching from the D850 and something that I appreciated. The button and dial layout. I do like that the EV dial is a physical dial. I could use my thumb instead of my shooting finger to adjust the exposure compensation, as I've had to do on my D850. Then that allowed me to keep pressing the shutter button while changing my exposure. I like the layout of the playback button on the right, especially when you're supporting a heavy lens in your left hand. It is extremely customizable compared to my Nikon or any other brand that I've used. There is practically no limitation on what you can assign to which custom button. There are many options, which I loved. What I wasn't too fond of is the menu system. This is something that Sony has improved on with the A1 camera. I, like many of my guests, find the menu system quite complicated. But once again, it's just like learning a new language. You will eventually get used to it. The weight is an advantage, but the size of the camera was something to get used to and something you might struggle with if you're used to using a larger camera. It felt a little bit unstable in my right hand, as I didn't feel that my palm could support much of the camera, and it was up to my fingers to grip the camera to make sure it stayed in my hand. A battery grip would definitely be beneficial, in my opinion, if you are considering getting this camera. Now for the ultimate question, is the Sony A9ii still a viable option for wildlife photographers in 2022? In my opinion, yes. The autofocus performance, including the tracking, is good enough to get you a much higher keeper rate. The frame advance rate of 20 frames per second is more than enough for wildlife photography. The image quality is great, but you'd probably have to be conservative with your ISO. I tried staying below 3,200, 4,000. The other reason that it might be a viable option for you is cost. With rumors of an A9 III coming out soon, it will most likely bring down the price of the A9ii even more. The combo that I used would cost you approximately $20,000. I buy some of my gear secondhand, used, and this makes it more affordable if you are indeed considering changing systems or brands. A used A9ii is $1,350 cheaper, and the 100-400 lens is $300 cheaper if you buy it used. The 600 lens is very hard to find used. However, you could just get the 200 to 600 lens to start off with. It's a superb lens, very sharp, with an extremely versatile focal length range, and it costs about $2,000 new and $1,637 used. Thanks so much for watching. I really appreciate it. I'd love to hear from you if you have an A9 II or if you consider buying an A9 II. So you're welcome to leave a comment for me below. Until next time, keep well. Bye-bye.